Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. Welcome to the Navigating the Blizzard series as it continues and as the crisis that we are in continues to grow and deepen and unfold in front of us. My name is Roger Hitchcock. I'm a senior partner at the Sadar Group, and I suppose our role and the way we're wanting to help people at the moment and businesses at the moment is to help them get through this COVID-19 crisis. And so today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about decision making under uncertainty. And when I looked at that title and looked at the content and was reflecting on decision making under uncertainty, I realized that that actually means all the time. The reality is the situations that we face, the scenarios that we're in, the businesses that we manage and govern are full of uncertainties. And obviously in today's world right now at this stage, March 2020, we're in the midst of an unfolding massive global crisis. But in reality, crises and uncertainty are pretty much standard in many businesses. I've often walked into boardrooms and asking how things are. People seldom say, oh, it's all going fine, everything's hunky-dory. Most of the time, we're facing crises and some kind of uncertainty at least. And even when we spoke about risk in a previous webinar, we spoke about how do we handle this concept of uncertainty in the world that is unfolding, but that exists in the world at all times. And so this webinar, the next one, I'm kind of treating as what I call a cluster, because part of decision making is the outcome of our decisions should be systems that enable our businesses to deliver and to continue to deliver what we are fundamentally on about, what we've promised in our vision and our mission and all of those kind of things. And so I do want to focus today on decision making and less about, I suppose, the types of decisions we're making, and more about how do you build a system that'll enable you to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. And so I think one of the opportunities, as we've said, and we've often quoted the fact that in crisis there is opportunity, and much opportunity, is to, during this time, don't only look at putting things in place for the crisis, but look at re-examining your business from the ground up. There may be an opportunity in many areas of the business, as we've discovered in ours, is to really do things properly, have deeper conversations, have more honest conversations, work hard at fixing the things in your business that don't only need to be sorted out for the crisis, but also will benefit. Your business will then benefit by being positioned to handle what lies ahead better and better. As we've said as well, just to remind you what we are aiming to do through this set of webinars, and we do encourage you to please, as you're going through them and as you're reflecting, all of the webinars are loaded back onto the webinar page after a day or so, and so you can go and revisit the concepts. Please also share those links to other people who need them. These are designed to get out and help people think through what is happening. And so in terms of the webinars, as we've said, as this thing unfolds, we want to help you to determine the next steps. And we've had thinking around risk, we've had thinking around stakeholders, we've had thinking around business rescue and strategy. And so it's thinking through the implications, determine the next steps, think through the implications and impact, and take the decisions. And that's what we're going to focus on today. We've thought implications and stakeholders and risk and strategy, but now we want to think about how do we take the decisions in a responsible but effective way, so that you can position yourselves and your businesses to see this thing through. And very important from a kind of our position or our perspective point of view, is we are talking to, and we have talked to, and we do talk to people at board level, or what I would often call governance level. Even if your business is not one with a formal board, every business is governed from the moment it starts, and the governance thinking is where the accountability lies. And I will start today by spending a bit of time focusing on some of those accountability issues around decisions, because the way we make our decisions is also how we stand behind our decisions and how our decisions are defensible into the future. These are designed as working webinars, so please ask questions, make comments using the Q&A or chat boxes, and as far as I can, I will engage with you. And hi once again, Aniki from Pretoria. Thanks for connecting once again. And yeah, seeing some familiar names, and I appreciate that, and we do appreciate that. Hopefully it's valuable. The quote that I came across, because part of the preparation I normally do is I look and see what are people saying and what have they said. And I really thought this was pertinent in terms of what we're going to discuss today. Sooner or later comes a crisis in our affairs, and how we meet it determines our future happiness and success. We've spoken a lot in this program, in the set of webinars, about preparing for, going through, and moving from a crisis, what I've termed a liminal space or a threshold. And our position is, as Sadar, is that obviously this is critical, and there will be some significant changes in how we do things and how we have to do things. But the most important thing is how we deal with what's coming at us is going to determine how successful and how happy we are into the future. Since the beginning of time, every form of life has been called upon to meet such crises. And obviously this crisis is unique, but it's not the first one people have faced. We've all heard about the Spanish flu, and some of us have even, in articles read about the bubonic plague. The reality is people have been through things before, and that's our position. And in today's webinar, we're saying, well, we believe that one of the critical things to do is to make the right decisions, so that the decisions that we make result in what I refer to there as well-designed and redesigned and reimagined, as we spoke about last time, processes, systems that are appropriate to not only what we're going into and through, but also what we're left with on the other side. When things improve, what we need systems that we've put in place to remain resilient and true. And a significant part of that is decision making. Critical thing in the governance space is that business is primarily and fundamentally about decision making and decision makers. And so what we want to unpack is the elements for better decision making and how we can start embedding those in our business. And whether our business is a small one-man band or a massive multinational, the reality is we can take and unpack and identify the elements of decision making, the flow of decision making, and make sure that we embed those things into our processes and our structures, and that people who we're giving decisions to make to are able to also follow the same process when we give them decisions to make. What we want to do in terms of the questions and to be as practical as possible, I try to ask myself a couple of questions up front in preparing, is to say, what do I want people to be able to walk away with? And I want you to be able to walk away with, what must we take into account? So how do we take accountability in our decision making? And then how should we decide? And so it's deciding responsibly. And so I want to unpack that in two ways, is to ask the question, well, first thing is we need to ask about decision-making and liability. And certainly at board level, at governance level, we have to recognize that the context for decision-making in our businesses, we often think of it as the business context. We think of it as the corporate or the process and the policy frameworks, but actually the ultimate context at the end of the day for decision-making is the law. And so a critical part of thinking about our decisions is how do we defend our decisions? And I know this sounds like a back-footed approach up front, but I've found that if we can recognize why we need to put certain things into our decision-making processes and do it from the beginning, we don't have to worry afterwards whether our decisions are defensible or not. In other words, we can structure our decision-making processes to be defensible as they happen. And what is significant in terms of the law is that internationally, corporate legislation has been changing quite significantly. Certainly throughout the regions we work primarily throughout Africa, and most of our legislation, our corporate legislation, has updated, has amended, has been refreshed in the last decade or two. And these shifts in the law have been significant and real and are ongoing. I expect that this crisis could trigger another set of thinking, because normally in thinking about the law, it's a crisis or a challenge that triggers rethinking legislation. And the primary thing about the corporate legislation is that there's been significant thinking about risks and liability, because to hold businesses accountable, and I'll unpack a few of these concepts in our decision-making process, the law has to understand where the risk and liability lies so that it can hold people to account. And ultimately, as a board member or on a board of directors is where the liability rests. It may not be created in the boardroom in terms of the specifics of the action of the company, but it ultimately rests in the boardroom. And that's really, really important to recognize and think about. And ultimately, risk and liability is also linked to both what you do and how you do it. What I mean by that is, in the past, the liability was essentially created, or it was identified where there was damage, and it was essentially linked to the damage or to the outcome. And many of those outcomes were very visible. But in today's world, it's not just what the outcome is, but how you got to the outcome that is critical to keep in mind, because you could even get to a good outcome, but the decision that was made or the way of getting to the outcome was fraudulent or was corrupt. And so the end and means are both important. And so it's not just the outcome of our decisions which are important to take into account, but it's also the fact that it's how we make the decisions that needs to be held to account. And so decision-making at a governance level is as much about the process we take to make the decision as it is about the decision itself. And that may sound complex, but actually once we unpack some of the legal requirements, there's great guidance in terms of thinking what are the elements we need to put into a decision process so that we as the decision makers can rest in the decisions we've made. We can be secure, we can be confident that if we've made a decision following a process and gone through the right steps, two things. Firstly, we should have a better decision. And secondly, the decision is defensible. And so I want to unpack some of what the law says and some concepts in law that are emerging. The second thing I want to talk about in this time together this afternoon is the decision-making in an organizational setup. And this is another assumption in the law, is that it's us and not me. Often in the big challenge in business is often we see things as the business leader, but in governance thinking and board level thinking, there is a team of leaders. So organizational leadership, especially in the law, is a team sport. I know that, often that we do have businesses with a sole director, but there is safety in numbers. And there is safety in numbers when we make decisions well together. And so how do we communicate to decide? And so the two things I want to touch on is I want to look at the legal element, and then I want to look at a communication flow to think about how do we structure our decisions in today's world, and especially in this crisis. And none of this implies that we need to build big bureaucratic, bulky systems. Actually, we can be very lean and mean in our decision making if we understand these two concepts and the challenges and address them properly. And so I want to talk about processes and elements and what the key elements of a decision would be or need to be from a legal point of view to be defensible, and how we can build that into our decision-making process so that the process defends us. And then how do we overlay that or build that into what I call communicating to decide together. And so let's start with decision-making and the law. And again, touching on some of the key elements, remember that ultimately accountability for the entire business rests on the board of a company, and directors in their personal, so individually and as a group collectively, are liable for everything that happens in a company. And obviously there is a challenge in that, especially when we hit a crisis, because the biggest danger is we stop making decisions because we are overly aware of the liability attached to that. And so it's interesting that around decision making, the key concept in running businesses is this tension between ethics and effectiveness. So we need this this tension. We need to make them decisions right, but they also need to be effective. And in a sense, that often creates, the tension between doing things right and doing things that actually make a difference and cause action when those actions could ultimately lead to implications in the future. And so to unpack a few core concepts or elements in the law, what does the law want to do first? Firstly, what the law does is it, what I call, creates or defines a space and then needs to find a person. The reason is that in law, what all laws try to do is they try to say, well, what is our sphere? What is the space that we operate in? And so a lot of legislation is boundaries. And so even in our own policy frameworks in our business, it's good to think of that in terms of spaces. You're accountable for the space of the business and the entire space of the business. But then in order for activity or action in that space to be effective, it needs to find a person to hold accountable. And so the law does two things to those people in the space. And those two things are, it gives authority. So the person in the space is actually authorized to do every single thing the space requires. And so what the company legislation does is it says to the board of a company, individually and collectively, you have all the authority to manage the affairs of this business. And obviously what boards have to do is give that away, but because the law has given you the authority, the law can hold you accountable. And that's essentially how law works, is this concept of space and people and authority and accountability. And so critical to decision making is to understand that you have, in effect, as a board member and as a group of board members, unlimited authority in terms of the company. You obviously have to take into account implications and impact. And that's why the law can also hold you accountable if you make decisions in a way that is potentially damaging or that is reckless or negligent. And that's the tension that we live in as directors or decision makers in our business. The other key thing is that when we think about decision making and compliance, a lot of decision making is balancing, or what I've called managing, different concepts or different elements. And one of the most important ones to manage in a business, especially when you have businesses where different people have a different, potentially or possibly conflicting or challenging or interests that pull in different directions. And here I'm thinking about what we typically call the three hats, where there are the three hats in a business of shareholder, director, and manager. And those are three separate roles in a business, and they each have their own clearly defined set of interests. And so in decision making, in a business context, you are making decisions as a director. You're liable as a director, irrespective of whether you are the other two as well. And so it's managing those three or four or five different interests in a business. It's even more challenging in family businesses. But a big part of that is to ensure that we act together as a board with independence of thinking. So one of the principal responsibilities of a board is to ensure that they act not for their own interests, but independently for the company's best interests. And I'm going to put on the next slide a few concepts coming out of the law of what the director's duties are to sum that up. And then the third thing we need to think about, and the third R, so there's interests, there's independence of thinking, and then there is impact. When we make decisions, we can't just make the decision reactively. We have to make the decision proactively or prospectively. In other words, we need to look into the future and ask ourselves, what is the intended effect or outcome? Because it's not just making the good decision, making a decision in a good way, but also understanding where the potential harm or damage lies in the future, the effect or the outcome, which could be perceived as damaging. And so part of the decision making is, what are the trade-offs? Because in today's world, there are a lot of trade-offs. And so with those concepts in mind, so there's accountability, there's authority, there's the space and the person, there's the three I's, and then it's important to understand what the legal duties of directors are. And this is the reason I put this in, is that a critical part of being a director is making decisions that have an impact on other people. Those decisions have an impact on the people in our business, and they have an impact on people outside of the business. And so what we need to understand is, what does the law say to us in terms of our duties as directors? And in law, there is this thing called a fiduciary duty. And a fiduciary duty is essentially a duty of care. And the key thing about that is it's expressed in those 3 words above it: care, skill, and diligence. And those are all in the best interest of the company. All right. And so the point of departure is that there's utmost good faith towards the company. They must act with necessary skill and care in performing their duties. They must act in good faith towards the company, in the best interest of the company. In other words, there must be an avoidance of conflict of interests. And in this time, you could find yourself extremely conflicted as a director, either because of your multiple roles in the business, which have different interests, or because you may be linked to other people in the business environment where there is a conflict. And there are ways of dealing with that. So understanding what those are enables us to deal with them. Not to use position for personal gain, which means if you're using the information gained as a director, you can essentially use it primarily for the best interest of that company, and then to exercise the powers for the purpose for which they were granted. And all of those things are directed towards the company. And so what the law does is it elevates the nature of liability, because it puts a high level of accountability on directors. But at the same time, it recognizes the practicality of having to act. And so in a number of legal jurisdictions, this concept is starting to emerge, the concept of what's called the business judgment rule. And the business judgment rule is designed to balance these 2 things, to balance the need or imperative and authority to decide and act, which is the responsibility given to directors. They are there to make decisions that enable the company to do what it needs to do, along with the directorial accountability and potential liability. And so directors are in this by definition, or by virtue of their sitting in the director's seat. They're sitting in this seat of high liability, but also this fairly elegant defense that is designed, and this is the business judgment rule is your defense. You can call on it by saying, have we gone through the loops or the hoops to meet this rule? And I'll unpack the rule for you in a slide or two. And what it enables directors to act. It promotes risk-taking in a well thought through, well structured framework. It doesn't promote risk-taking that is negligent, that is reckless, but it certainly promotes well thought through risk-taking and decision-making. That's what we're going to unpack today. It also encourages competent people to serve as directors. So it's understanding that sitting around a boardroom table, there's also the question of who is there. And if in this crisis, you as a board or as decision makers in your company are looking around the table and saying, well, we don't have the skills or the competence, then the first thing you need to do is identify parties that can help you. And those people may be in your business. How do you bring them into the decision-making process? Even if it's just part of exploring the options available to you. And so we need to be getting lots and lots of competent people into the process, but into a process that enables us to make decisions. Also, thirdly, and this is an important thing, is that what the law doesn't want to have to do is climb into your business and ask or remake the decision. It doesn't want to have to get in and say, did you could have done this and you didn't do that. And the law isn't interested in second guessing your decision. The law is interested in understanding whether you went through a robust process of decision making, because in any decision, there's a recognition in the law. So the law is very pragmatic. It takes the view that some of your decisions will end up in potential damage or potential perception of damage. But your protection as a director is in the way you make the decisions as much as it is in ensuring that there is as little damage as possible. And so what the business judgment test consists of, and this is where we move into saying, how do we build some of these elements into our decision-making process? So if you're writing down some notes, this is being clear on what the decision is about. And I found that in our business, what we're doing is we're trying to be far clearer, and it's been something we've been working on for a while, but it's really clarifying, are we absolutely clear in terms of what this clearly defined conscious decision is about. And it could be a decision to do something or not to do something. And the best way to clarify it is to write it down. Because if it's written down, it helps everybody to see and to agree and to debate what that wording should be. Too often we throw around concepts and we're not clear enough. And if we're not clear enough about what the decision is, it's often very difficult to move forward. Failure to act doesn't draw on this defense, neither does rubber stamping. So if you're simply approving other decisions or decisions that have been made elsewhere, you can't call upon this defense when something happens. The second part of the decision is that directors are expected, there's a high level of expectation on directors to do some serious evaluations, various risks, impacts, consequences related to the decision being made. So you're expected to turn it over in your minds. You're expected to examine it from all kinds of angles, but you're obviously expected to do that as efficiently as possible. And so once we've been clear about what it is, we also need to be clear about what are the underlying assumptions, as well as what the impact of this decision would be, thinking into the future and asking ourselves the question, are we aware or are we clear about what we think this decision is intended to achieve or to end up in? And then once we've got clearly the actual decision itself, in a sense, the first hurdle to jump over is to make sure that we as directors know what we're doing and we know enough about the decision or about the nature of the decision to be able to make that decision. And so this is the process of exploration. And I want to quickly, I'll come back to this slide, but I want to show you the definition and this is straight out of the South African Companies Act, but it's reflected in a number of different jurisdictions, because one of the things that directors used to do too often is call on ignorance as a defense. And so this is the definition of knowing, knowingly, or knows. And it's when used with directors and officers. So a concept is decision makers in a business. When used with respect to the person, relation to the matter, means that A, the person had actual knowledge of the matter, and that's in a sense where a dictionary would end. But the law goes on to say that either that or they were in a position in which the person reasonably ought to have had actual knowledge of the matter. So what the law is doing is it's assuming that the people sitting in the seat of directorship have knowledge of the matters that they're making decisions about. And so ignorance is no longer a defense. The law allows investigation, it allows other measures to be taken. And so this process, this first stage of knowing, is about being informed. Did you do whatever was necessary? And part of the communication process I'll unpack next gives us the opportunity to show that we've done a lot to know what we're doing, because it's the process used to come to the decision and not necessarily the merits of the decision, which would be under investigation. The law, as I said, isn't looking to second guess you. The law wants to know how you made the decision, not necessarily what decision you made. Once we've looked at that, the key thing, so knowing, being informed is the first key thing. Second key thing is the absence of a conflict of interest. So is there clearly in your decision-making process the opportunity for people to be asked about their conflict? And I always advise that we ask a very definitive question. Are you conflicted or not? And there's only one binary option, yes or no. If someone says, I don't know, then it's got to be stopped and it's got to be explored. Because what you want to do is by declaring a conflict and recusing, there's no liability at this stage, but what you're actually doing by removing yourself, if you're the conflicted person, from the decision, you are protecting the integrity of the decision. As a chairman, by asking someone who's conflicted to leave the room and not participate any further in the decision, you're protecting the integrity of the decision and you're defending everybody, including the person who is conflicted in that situation. And then thirdly, and this is probably the key thing, is that there must be a rational basis for the decision and there must be good faith. And good faith assumes that there's a rational business purpose. And good faith is summed up in the question, how is this decision in the best interest of the company? It comprises obviously integrity and honesty, but it's the biggest discussion and debate must be about what is in the best interests of the company. And so when one looks at these three things and looks at them together, you've got to ask the question, have we taken reasonably diligent steps to become informed about the matter? And I'll show you some steps to take and some processes to think about in your communication. You see, the law assumes that. The law doesn't allow you to say, well, we didn't, because if you trip up at that hurdle, you are liable. Secondly, what the law is most interested in from a technical point of view is making sure that the decision was made, it's a second and third element, in the best interest of the company, which means if there is another interest in the room, it's best to remove it. And so the law requires declaration of conflict of interest. And if a person is conflicted, they need to recuse themselves or remove themselves from the decision. And obviously that would be recorded as well. And then thirdly, is there a rational basis for believing that the decision was in the best interest of the company? And that's essentially what I've called the crux. That's around which everything revolves. So when we think about our decision-making process, we've got to ask ourselves, do we give enough time to know and to become informed? Do we get the right people in the room? And I see as a question, if you do not have the skills in the business to invite into the boardroom or get a consultant, what do you do? I know the board is still accountable. What you need to do is you need to do your homework. And again, remember, we're also not talking about perfection. The law is very pragmatic. The law says it's about following a good process that will enable you to make essentially the best decision given the circumstances. And so one of the key tools in decision making is to identify what you know, what you don't know, and what you don't know, you don't know. We've all heard those phrases, but we can use that in our decision-making process to try to close the don't know what we don't know gap. And where we know that we don't know something, we try to find the person or the skills, or we do our own research. It could be that we have to pick up a few books and read. And especially in today's world, we need to be sharing our information as well. And it also relates to who we've got around the boardroom table. If everybody around the boardroom table has exactly the same skill set, it's going to be very difficult to potentially become fully informed about that matter. And then thinking about conflict. So have you got in your decision-making process a clear question about conflict? And whether you ask that question up front, or certainly before the decision is before you've unpacked and asked about interests, which is the interest of the company, that person or any person would be removed or recused from the decision. And then how have you spelt out, how have you debated? Because the basis, the rational basis would be an analysis and a debate and ultimately decision-making process to decide or to discern. And so critical to thinking about the business judgment rule, the accountability, the person in the space, is to say, well, then directors essentially need to be two things. And if you're sitting on a board, you need to be two things. Firstly, you do need to be opinionated, but I would say you need to have informed opinions. And so creating a gap between formulating what the decision is and formulating your opinion on the decision, there needs to be a gap, because it's in that space that you become informed on your own before you then bring that into the boardroom and share those together. And it's in sharing those things together that the second characteristic is most important, because directors also need to be persuadable. And so what I've found happening, and I've tried to exercise these things myself, is that listening becomes absolutely essential. I obviously talk for a living, but I find that I need to listen more, especially in meetings, because a number of times in the last few weeks when we've had critical decisions to make, I find myself putting an opinion on the table and then changing my mind because I've been persuaded. Because someone else has come up, has put something else on the table that has either persuaded me to their position, or it's modified my position and their position to something in between. Because ultimately, we're not making decisions based on what my opinion is or my other director's opinion is. We're making decisions based on what is in the best interests of the company. And so critical when we're thinking about our decision-making process, are we informed? Do we have a potential for making sure the interests are aligned by removing any conflict of interest? And thirdly, have we actually processed the information enough so that we make the decision in the best interest of the company? And I thought this quote was really pertinent. Crises and deadlocks, when they occur, have at least this advantage, that they force us to think. And so the work of directors especially now, is to think deeper, harder, further than we've ever thought before, but recognizing that the second part of this webinar is to say we need to think together. And so we need to decide together, because it's in our togetherness that we make better decisions. And there's a lot. Most books of wisdom, I know that in the Bible it talks about the fact that there is wisdom in much counsel. And so obviously we don't want to get thrust into the confusing, and this is essential in today's world, is to discern what the sources of information are and have those discussions as a board and say, who are we going to listen to? Find the right people, find the experts, because they're out there, and build that into our decision-making flow. And so the flow of decision-making is what I call a path of communication. And there is a clear path of helpful communication that helps us get to a better decision. And there are different types of communication, and some of us are better at some aspects than others. And part of thinking about a systematic process is to ensure we communicate in the right way at the right time. And I learned this process. I've done team facilitation and I've done strategic facilitation over a number of years. And this model of communication has emerged over time, because I've realized that part of my role as facilitator is to ensure that if we can structure the right type of thinking along a timeline, we can actually get through an effective decision-making process. And again, this is not about creating a whole lot of bureaucracy and time. This process flow I'm going to take you through now is something that could take days, all right, in terms of, some strategic facilitations I've run on days, and we've managed this flow of dialogue, discussion, and debate, and I'll unpack what those are. It could happen in 5 or 10 minutes, where we have a meeting, we have a decision to make, and we actually can go through this process as quickly as possible. And so, what does this actually look like? And I want to try to draw it for you. I'm a visual thinker, so I tend to draw these things. And it starts with this concept of, and another thing that some of you may know about me is I normally look at words and I think, well, what does that word actually mean? And so dialogue is an interesting word, because it comes from the concept, or the concepts of to flow together, to move together through, to allow to flow. So there's an opening up in terms of dialogue. It normally starts with a blank page. Now, obviously, it would be framed, and that's why I chose a square there, or rectangle, because the framing is the decision we need to make. So in light of that decision, we need a first dialogue. And what dialogue does is it's the process of exploring and opening things up. So in a decision-making process, we want to make sure that we've got lots of information to work with. And this would overlap with what I would say the first step of the business judgment test is becoming informed. So in becoming informed about something, it's critical to open up the floor for exploration. It also dignifies all the parties. It allows everybody to bring their opinion to the table. I've seen it happen where people who don't often speak up are given the space to speak, and that enables them to put an idea on the table, which is then dignified. And also what they do is people, once they've put the decision or their ideas on the table, we can treat the idea separately from the person. If people don't put their ideas on the table and they hold them to themselves, then when we attack the idea, and when I attack in inverted commas, when we challenge the idea, we're seen as challenging the person. And so the process of dialogue is to get everything out there. It's a divergent process. And some tools for thinking here is to look at the environment. So looking out, looking in, looking at the environment, looking in at ourselves. And that's a process of searching out as much information as possible. It's looking, what can we learn from out there? What can we see out there? What can we learn from inside? Looking at each person, allowing them to bring their own thoughts, their own ideas. It could be called, another alternative is brainstorming. This is very much what we would normally call brainstorming. I prefer the word dialogue because it's a bit more structured, I suppose, and a bit more intentional. It's also about looking back. Are there things we can look back on because we can bring our value and our experience to the table? And then also looking forward. So when we get to a process of dialogue, we do want to end up in that dialogue process of looking clearly at the impact of the decision. So looking forward and being clear about, have we thought widely about the potential impact of the decision that we're making? So opening things up is critical as a first step. And this is essentially where we start to answer the knowing question, as I said, addressed in the business judgment test. Second thing we need to do is discuss. And the challenge is some of us are better at discussion than dialogue. All right. Some people are very good at dialogue and not very good at discussion. Some people are very good at discussion and not very good at dialogue. And what discussion is essentially, it's the analysis. And the danger is we start discussion too soon and we stop the flow of dialogue. And the reason that is also tied to the root word of the word discussion. And so it's a process of analysis. It needs to be done skillfully, because if we don't do it skillfully, it can become destructive. See, the word discussion comes from the Latin word discutere, which is a hammer. And so effectively what we're doing when we are discussing, skillfully discussing things, is we're taking what's on the table in dialogue and we are analyzing it. We move into an analysis of the issues. And so if we haven't had sufficient dialogue, we don't have much to discuss. And we've all been in those meetings where everybody says the same thing and we go around the same issue over and over again and we wonder why there's a deadlock. It's probably a symptom that we haven't had enough dialogue. We haven't thought enough, we haven't thought widely enough before we start to converge. All right, and so discussion is by definition a converging process. It's ensuring that things are addressed objectively. We can now deal with the issues, the ideas that are on the table. We're not attacking people anymore because their ideas are on the table. And what we're looking for when we do discussion is we're thinking about, well, okay, how do all these little ideas, so we've got lots of little ideas on the table here. How do we make sure, how do we start understanding how they're linked? How do we understand how they're grouped? All right. How do we understand how they're related to one another? How they influence one another? And so the process of discussion should end up, it's converging because it should gather the information into a number of clear options that we have at the end of the discussion process. And again, in terms of time, this doesn't need to take forever if it's done well. If we've given enough time to the dialogue, then our discussion process can be efficient and we can use some tools. There are lots of tools to use. And so some of the thinking there is to examine, in terms of the information on the table, is to go back and ask the question, how does this link to our ultimate purpose? How does this reflect our values? Or how can we use this information to reflect our values? What are the priorities that emerge from the information that we've got on the table? What practices, in other words, it's going from the invisible purpose, values, priorities up to the practices. And what are we going to do at the end of the day, and who's going to do it? Because a critical thing about action in business is we've got to also create accountability. And so we have those discussions up and down, and we use those in a sense as filters to analyze the information that is on the table. And then this is where we think about also things like interests and disclosure. So we are in this analysis, we are looking at the links, we're looking at the relationships, and it could be here that we realize that a person is related, so we have to remove them from the process. So it's really analytical. It's the right place to ask the more technical questions about the information and how it links in as well. And then the third process, or the third element of communication, is the word debate, or the process of debate. And in another interesting root word is that the BAT in the word debate is the same BAT in the word battle. And so debate is where there is a battle, there is a fight. This is where, and this is why I did choose two, apparently aggressive people, because this is where the tensions could rise. And not in a negative way. And I think part of the process of governing or facilitating a decision-making process is recognizing that there are going to be different opinions. There are going to be fights. There are going to be defending and attacking. But once you've got through dialogue and discussion, you're debating the right thing. And you're not arguing and attacking people. You are arguing for pros and cons. You're arguing for benefits. You're weighing up things. You're actually allowing the best ideas to win. And it's ultimately battling to drive things to the point of decisions and to determine what specific actions are to be taken to move things forward. And that's the concept of debate. It is the battling. And it's, as I said, weighing things up, allowing the best ideas to win ultimately all in the best interest of the company. And so there's knowing, there's disclosing, and the debate, the framing of the debate has to be, what do we believe is in the best interest of the company? And obviously with strong, opinionated people in the room, you're going to get an argument and a bit of a battle. But the idea is then to make ultimately a decision and to decide. And an interesting thing about the word decide is I chose a picture there of two roads. In this time going ahead, there are going to be trade-offs. You can't take every road. I used in one of the other webinars, I used the metaphor, or in a discussion with a group, I used the metaphor that this isn't a cross-section or a cross-intersection. This is a T-junction we've come to. Some of our decisions are not, in other words, there is no option in some senses, in some cases, to go forward, because forward for many of us is very, very constrained. It's about deciding and choosing one or the other. And there is also a picture in the word decide, and also it comes from the Latin, and it's the CID or the CIS in the word decision. And the picture there is the picture of killing, because CID or CIS is the word for kill in Latin. And so essentially what you're doing when you decide, the phrase that I often use is that you're murdering alternatives. What you're doing is you've, at the end of a debate process, you have taken your options that flow out of your discussion and you have weighed them up. You've put them in the scales here, all right? You've judged them in your debate, and coming out of the debate process, you need to then decide. And the decision means that you need to, what I often refer to as, murder some of those alternatives, so that at the end of the day, you only have one that is left, all right? Technically, I often say that what you can do is bottle them, because you can keep them for future use. But ultimately, there is one of the most disempowering aspects often of decision making is that when a good decision is made, everybody leaves the room and they revert to their opinion. And you can't afford to do that in the boardroom. In today's critical situation, in a crisis, you can't afford to simply revert to the opinion you had at the beginning, because you held that close to your chest. And so the dialogue process, and so if we think about it, the dialogue process is getting it all out there. All the ideas need to be put on the table. This is about grouping and gathering and analyzing so that we end up with a few clear options. Debate is about weighing it up and arguing and fighting. It's about being persuaded, opinionated, and that's the dynamic, which is healthy because we've had the dialogue and the discussion process. It's unhealthy if we dive into that up front, because then we attack one another. And then recognizing that when we decide as a team of people, we need to walk away with the one option. We need to all stand behind and all need to back the one thing that we are standing behind in the decision. And then obviously flowing from this, and what we're going to look at next time is to say, there are obviously two more Ds. We've had dialogue, we've had discuss, we've had debate, we've had decide, and the two critical Ds are do, which means ultimately, how do we then allocate that to people to do the work? So accountability, and what are the tools we use for that? And a concept we've unpacked a few times in some of these webinars is ultimately the doing is the performance of the business. And so if the business needs to perform, to what extent are the people involved, and to what extent are the systems we build involved? And so our decision-making process needs to be saying, how do we build our systems and how do we allocate accountability to our people? And then a critical concept, and it comes from the first part, the legal liability part of this webinar, is it's absolutely critical to document the process. Now, again, that needn't be formal, in terms of fancy formats, as long as there is a record of the decision-making process. Because remember, impact is long-term. So when we think about decisions, we could make a decision today in 2020, and the impact of that decision comes out in 5 years' time. And how are we going to remember what actually happened unless there is a document to refer to that is a substantial reflection of the decisions that we made? And that's why board process is so important. And so the process of thinking, the process of getting informed, the process of disclosing conflict of interest, the process of asking the question, is this in the best interest of the company, are absolutely critical in terms of our decision-making process. And so those are the two foundation stones I wanted to lay for you today in terms of the decision-making process. It's absolutely critical, number one, to remember that when we make decisions as board members or directors or decision makers, and that would also include management, because in the law there's the concept of prescribed officer, which essentially encapsulates everybody who is in a significant decision-making position in a business. Absolutely critical. And everybody who makes decisions in the best interest of the company should be asking the question, do I know what I need to know to make this decision right now? If you don't know, put up your hand and find someone who knows. You find it in your business. There are lots of people out there who have either special insight or experience in your in your sector, or who just know how things should work in different parts of the world. And especially those of you like us who operate in multiple regions, absolutely critical. You don't get better than people on the ground who know what's happening. Make sure there's no conflict as well, and be clear about that. Be clear about the questions you ask, and then essentially benchmarking or aligning every single decision with what is in the best interest of the company, which, if you've had a solid strategic conversation and identified your objectives with the best interest of the company in mind, you're essentially aligning your decision making to the strategic objectives of the business. And then to ask the question, and as I wind down, please put in, I have seen a couple of questions and comments come up on the slide, but then looking at communication flow. And part of this process is to facilitate the process between dialogue and discussion and debate. And so maybe in your own team, someone in the team needs to take accountability for the process. Often that person has to stand outside to some extent of the content and the conversation. But it's really, really important that the process is governed in terms of those critical areas, and understanding that there is a shift in thinking from dialogue thinking, open up, to discussion thinking, which is convergent and analytical, to debate thinking, which is recognizing that that's where things are about fighting it out in the best possible way, to decision thinking, which means we can only walk away with one thing we can do at the end of the day. And so facilitating that process and using tools available. Question about benchmarks. I'm not quite sure what that means, but if you're thinking about tools, there are a lot of tools in the decision-making space. I've got a couple of minutes. I can maybe just share one or two of them with you, and some of the tools that I've used. The one that I've called is called the Big Easy. A lot of people use this tool and this framework, but once we've got a list of possible actions that we need to take, we can rank them by two dimensions. One is how easy are they, and one is what is the impact of them. And then if we say these are easy things to do, these are hard things to do, these are things with low impact, they're not going to really make a difference. These are things with high impact, they're going to have the biggest difference on the business. And then we rank them, we score them, and then we rank them. And where we obviously want to be focusing our attention is we want to start here, because those are the things that are easiest to do with a higher impact, and then work our way into that space. Another tool to think about in our decision making, and so some of these we'll unpack maybe a bit next time. It's what I call the push me pull you. You may have seen that there was a story when I was growing up with a push me pull you, which was an animal that had two heads. One went in one direction, one went in the other direction. And so it's when we're listing the decisions, asking the question, what is pulling us towards the future and what is holding us back? And so we can take action against those kind of things. And so the decision-making process is one that could be mapped out. Another set of thinking is to say, well, let's determine as well the types of decisions we need to make. and a recent book that I've picked up recently because it is about decision making and uncertainty. Ironically, it was published, I think, this month, and it talks about the difference between puzzles and mysteries. And puzzles are things that are solvable, and some things are solvable. Engineering, medicine often is solvable. This coronavirus is essentially a puzzle. We've got to figure out how to solve it, whereas a mystery is something that is unsolvable, because there are so many things. And so we need to understand the nature of the decisions we're making. And then the other one is a book by a guy called Simon Sinek, who writes a book called The Infinite Game. He's basing it on someone's, another book of a similar title, but he's saying, are we playing, are our decisions part of our business, which we know there's an end point, because a finite game comes to the end, it's scored, there's a resolution at the end. It's a bit like a puzzle. An infinite game is one that keeps going. And so there's no end point. And in business, sustainability, there's no end point in a sense. We need to look at the horizon and look strategically. So really important in terms of thinking what are we looking for? What must we take into account to determine the type of decisions we're making, the nature of those decisions, and the legality and the legal requirements of the decision-making process. And then also, how do we decide responsibly? And I think together, deciding responsibly is about really managing and facilitating the flow of communication so that we get to the point where we are substantially happy with the decisions we've made. We know what we're doing. We've explored as far as is possible. We haven't got overly tied up in paralysis by analysis, but we understand we need to move forward, and we've got enough information to move forward with. We've analyzed it with a clear view of getting to an outcome, and then we've debated, we've given people a chance to defend and to attack the ideas and to find the best idea and the best combination of ideas, and then we've decided. And then we've obviously allocated accountability for that decision, and we've documented the process so that we've got something that is defensible. So I trust that has been helpful, and I encourage you to think about your decision-making processes going forward. If there are any other questions as I close, then please pop them onto the Q&A box. And I just thought very, very pertinent as well. Deep within every crisis is an opportunity for something beautiful. And I do know that there is lots of damage and lots of fear and lots of concern and lots of anxiety, but deep inside this crisis, I am sure that there are things going to emerge. We've seen the beauty of how people are engaging. We've seen the beauty of people, leaving food out for essential services. We've seen the beauty of the applauding of the nurses and the doctors internationally. So there are things that are incredible coming out of this crisis. And so I encourage you to look for those things in your own business. And then what we're doing, just lastly, before I sign off, is we are going to be consolidating some of this thinking together with some tools and templates and some ideas around decision making in crisis, using very practical case examples, providing a set of tools and a bit of a toolbox in what we're calling navigating COVID-19, which is going to be deployed as a half-day online workshop, so available to anybody around the globe. It will obviously be, deployed probably in mornings South African time, but this is going to be aimed at revising and reviewing and helping you to unpack and to determine the way forward. So please watch out for that. I know that the communications have started to go out. Thank you very much. As I've been saying, stay safe and sanitized, and we'll see you next time. And I trust it's been valuable. Please also complete this survey that comes up as you close the webinar, and I trust we'll see you online in the weeks that lie ahead. Signing off.